April 29, 1945. A freezing, ash-colored Sunday morning in the deeply shattered, blood-soaked heart of Bavaria. The battle-hardened American soldiers of the U.S. 45th Infantry Division, the legendary Thunderbirds, were pushing relentlessly through the crumbling remnants of the German landscape. They were exhausted, covered in a mixture of freezing mud and dried blood, believing they were simply advancing to secure a standard, unremarkable military supply depot, or perhaps a munitions factory on the outskirts of Munich. They had absolutely no idea that they were walking straight into the darkest, most terrifying, and profoundly evil nightmare of the 20th century. Just outside the main perimeter of the sprawling complex, the advancing infantrymen found a desolate railroad track. Sitting completely silent and motionless in the biting cold were 39 dilapidated cattle cars. The American soldiers, seasoned men who had survived the absolute worst of the European theater, smelled the overwhelming, sickening, sweet and sour stench of mass death long before they actually looked inside the wooden cars. When a young, combat-fatigued American lieutenant finally stepped up to the rusted metal doors and peered into the freezing gloom of the first car, he let out a visceral, horrified scream that completely froze the blood of every man in his platoon. Piled inside the train, car after horrific car, were the bodies of thousands of starved, beaten, and frozen men, women, and children. They were stacked carelessly on top of each other like discarded, rotting garbage. This was the infamous Dachau death train. The fanatical German SS guards had simply crammed thousands of human beings into these suffocating wooden boxes without food or water, locking them inside to die a slow, agonizing death of thirst and exposure as the Allied armies advanced across Germany. The American soldiers standing by those tracks were not green recruits. They were hardened, cynical veterans who had fought through the bloody, freezing mud of the Italian mountains and the brutal meat-grinder hedgerows of France. They had seen their closest friends blown completely apart by screaming artillery shells. They had watched men burn inside Sherman tanks. But they had never, in all their years of brutal combat, seen anything that even approached this level of systemic, psychopathic cruelty. The human mind is simply not designed to process the sight of 2,000 starved corpses. One tough 19-year-old combat veteran from Oklahoma, a boy who had killed men in close quarters combat without blinking, dropped his M1 Garand rifle into the mud, collapsed entirely into the freezing snow, and began sobbing uncontrollably, his mind violently rejecting the reality of what his eyes were seeing. But for the rest of the heavily armed infantrymen, that profound, crushing sadness almost instantly mutated into something infinitely more dangerous. It turned into a cold, shaking, apocalyptic, and purely murderous rage. They looked up from the train of the dead at the towering, heavily fortified SS watchtowers looming in the distance. They tightened their grip on the cold steel of their weapons, their knuckles turning completely white. In that exact terrifying moment, the civilized rules of war, the Geneva Convention, and the very concept of military discipline simply evaporated into the freezing German air. Before we completely rip open the highly classified military files and reveal the heavily censored, deeply controversial truth of how General George S. Patton personally handled the massacre that inevitably followed, I need you to do something. If you want the raw, unfiltered, and deeply uncomfortable history that the polite, sanitized textbooks are absolutely terrified to print, hit that subscribe button right now. We do not do soft, politically correct, heavily redacted summaries on this channel. We look directly at the brutal, unrelenting violence of the past and the uncompromising, hardened men who had to make impossible, life-altering choices in a world that had gone completely mad. Type the word revenge in the comments right now if you are ready to see exactly what happens when disciplined American soldiers completely snap and a legendary, unapologetic general decides that sometimes cold-blooded murder is the absolute only form of true justice. When the furious, trembling American troops finally breached the main iron gates of the Dachau concentration camp, the sheer arrogance of the Nazi regime was on full display. The camp commandant had cowardly fled into the night, leaving behind an arrogant, cleanly dressed, 20-year-old SS lieutenant named Heinrich Wicker. In a display of mind-boggling psychopathic detachment, Wicker walked out of the camp waving a crisp white flag of surrender. He had carefully polished his black leather boots and brushed his immaculate uniform, fully expecting to be treated with the gentlemanly respect and diplomatic courtesy afforded to a surrendering officer under the international laws of the Geneva Convention. An exhausted, blood-spattered American officer looked at the well-fed, perfectly groomed Nazi lieutenant, looked back at the towering piles of starving, emaciated human skeletons collapsing behind the barbed wire, and violently spit directly into the German officer's face. In that fraction of a second, total, unhinged, violent chaos immediately broke loose across the entire complex. While 30,000 liberated, starving prisoners rushed the electrified fences, screaming with joy and weeping at the sight of the American uniforms, the U.S. infantrymen were not celebrating. They were actively, methodically hunting. A group of approximately 50 SS guards, suddenly realizing that their apocalyptic war was completely lost and that they were surrounded by heavily armed ghosts, attempted to surrender near an imposing brick wall by a coalyard. They frantically raised their hands into the air, tossing their weapons to the ground and shouting, "Hitler kaputt! Hitler is finished!" They desperately hoped that these magic words of submission would activate the Americans' sense of duty and save their miserable lives. They were dead wrong. The men of the 45th Infantry Division were no longer operating as a standard military unit. They had become the terrifying, unstoppable hand of vengeance. An American lieutenant, widely believed by historians to be First Lieutenant Jack Bushyhead, a Native American officer from Oklahoma, stood watching them. Bushyhead was visibly physically shaking with an uncontrollable rage. He had just walked through the camp's extermination facilities. He had just witnessed the crematorium ovens, still radiating heat, completely full of human ash and bone fragments. He looked at the healthy, arrogant SS guards standing against the wall, men who had eaten full meals while children starved to death yards away. Bushyhead didn't even bother to yell a verbal command to his men. He simply made a sharp, definitive gesture with the barrel of his Thompson submachine gun. "Line them up." The terrified Germans, suddenly realizing that the polite rules of surrender were not going to apply today, began to panic. They frantically shuffled against the cold brick wall. A heavy .30 caliber American machine gun was instantly slammed down onto a tripod, its metal belt of ammunition clicking into place with a terrifying, mechanical finality. "9! Geneva Convention!" one of the SS guards screamed, his arrogant facade completely shattering. But the American machine gunner, a soldier nicknamed Bird Eye, stared back at them with eyes that were completely, terrifyingly blank. He looked at Lieutenant Bushyhead for the final order. The lieutenant, his face a mask of pure stone, gave a single, barely perceptible nod. The deafening, earth-shattering roar of heavy machine gun fire instantly tore through the freezing morning air. The sustained burst of completely unrestrained automatic fire lasted for 10 agonizing, chaotic seconds. When the thick, choking gunsmoke finally cleared from the courtyard, the pristine snow was completely black with blasted coal dust and stained deep, horrific red with SS blood. The guards were utterly slaughtered, their bodies ripped apart and piled grotesquely against the base of the brick wall. When a superior American officer, Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, heard the colossal roar of the gunfire, he came sprinting across the compound. He saw his men actively firing into the twitching pile of German bodies. Sparks pulled out his Colt .45 pistol and fired it directly into the air, screaming at the top of his lungs, "Stop it! What the hell are you doing?" The machine gunner slowly took his finger off the trigger and looked up at his commanding officer. He wasn't apologizing. He wasn't sorry. Tears were streaming rapidly down his dirt-streaked face as he shouted back, his voice cracking with pure emotion, "Colonel, they deserved it." But the coalyard massacre was not an isolated incident. It was merely the spark that ignited a massive powder keg of absolute, brutal retribution. For one bloody, lawless, and entirely surreal hour, the Dachau concentration camp was completely turned over to the victims and their heavily armed avengers. SS guards who desperately tried to surrender by climbing down from the towering watchtowers with their hands raised were shown zero mercy. The American soldiers didn't even wait for their boots to hit the ground. They simply shot them straight off the wooden ladders, watching their bodies plunge into the stagnant water of the camp's moat. The G is then calmly walked up to the edge of the water and completely emptied their heavy M1 Garand magazines into the floating bodies, just to be absolutely sure the monsters were dead. One American soldier later wrote a deeply haunting letter home stating, "It wasn't war, it was an execution, and I didn't feel a thing. After what I saw in those boxcars, they weren't human to me anymore." Simultaneously, the liberated prisoners, skeletal men who had been brutalized for years, realized that their tormentors were suddenly powerless, driven by a massive primal surge of adrenaline that defied their physical starvation. The inmates hunted down the remaining SS guards and the hated capos, prisoners who had collaborated with the Nazis to beat their fellow inmates. They dragged an SS guard down from a watchtower. They didn't have firearms. They had rusted shovels, heavy wooden sticks, and their bare, bony hands. The heavily armed American soldiers simply stood back, forming a perimeter, casually smoking their Lucky Strike cigarettes and watching the brutal scene unfold. When a junior officer nervously asked a battle-hardened sergeant if they should step in and stop the violence to uphold the rules of war, the sergeant took a drag from his cigarette, looked at the brutalized prisoners and coldly replied, "No, let them finish." The inmates literally tore the Nazi guard apart. In another sector of the camp, prisoners grabbed a notorious brutal capo and violently drowned him headfirst in a latrine. It was completely primal. It was savagely violent. It was the purest, most unfiltered form of battlefield justice ever witnessed. However, a massive, uncoordinated massacre of unarmed, officially surrendering prisoners, no matter how profoundly evil, sadistic, and deserving those prisoners were, was a catastrophic, undeniable violation of international military law. The United States Army prided itself on being the civilized liberators of Europe, not a roving band of executioners. Within days, the terrifying, bloody secret of Dachau leaked out of the camp. Graphic photographs taken by combat photographers, showing American GIs standing triumphantly over piles of executed bullet-riddled German guards, inevitably reached the high command. The military bureaucracy immediately shifted into high gear. An official high-level investigative team led by Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Whitaker was rapidly dispatched to the site. The investigators, men with clean uniforms who had not looked into the eyes of the corpses on the death train, coldly interviewed the traumatized soldiers, aggressively collected the photographs, and compiled a massive, damning, highly classified report titled "Investigation of Alleged Mistreatment of German Guards at Dachau." The legal report was absolutely devastating. It formally concluded that American troops of the 45th Infantry Division had blatantly and repeatedly violated international law. It officially recommended immediate severe court-martials for the officers and machine gunners involved. The military lawyers sitting safely behind desks wanted to brand the very men who had stopped the Holocaust as convicted war criminals, stripping them of their rank, their honor, and sending them to military prison. That explosive, heavily documented legal nightmare was sent directly up the rigid chain of command until it landed squarely on the expansive, polished wooden desk of the commanding general of the United States Third Army, General George S. Patton. This is the exact pivotal moment in history where the polished, sanitized mythology of the American military collides violently with the gritty, uncompromising, and terrifying reality of old blood and guts. Patton was a famously strict, almost tyrannical disciplinarian. He was a commander who would mercilessly fine a frontline soldier for not wearing a standard-issue helmet, or aggressively demote an officer for having unpolished boots in an active combat zone. The rigid legal officers who drafted the Dachau report fully expected Patton to sign the court-martial papers without hesitation, sacrificing his own men to military prison in order to protect the pristine, diplomatic image of the Allied forces on the world stage. But these bureaucrats fundamentally, completely misunderstood the deeply complex warrior psychology of George S. Patton. Patton had recently personally toured the absolute unimaginable horrors of the Ohrdruf and Buchenwald concentration camps. He had physically broken down and vomited violently against the side of a wooden barracks after smelling the decaying flesh of Hitler's victims. He had forced the civilian population of nearby German towns to march through the camps and look directly at the rotting corpses their government had created. Patton harbored a deep, visceral, apocalyptic hatred for the SS. He had openly, repeatedly referred to them not as enemy soldiers, but as the absolute slime of the earth, rabid, diseased animals that had completely forfeited their fundamental right to exist in a civilized world. When the investigating military officer stood rigidly at attention in Patton's Munich office and confidently stated that the photographs and witness testimonies were undeniable, concrete evidence of American war crimes, the atmosphere in the room instantly dropped to absolute zero. Patton picked up the thick, detailed legal report and looked at it with a gaze of such absolute, freezing disgust that it terrified his own staff. He aggressively threw the heavy document back onto his desk. He looked the rigid legal officer dead in the eyes and demanded to know how any sane human being could walk into a literal factory of death like Dachau, see thousands of rotting corpses stacked like firewood on a freezing train, and genuinely expect 19-year-old combat-fatigued farm boys from Oklahoma to politely follow a diplomatic legal rulebook. Patton's voice, usually a high-pitched command, dropped into a lethal growl. He explicitly stated that his men were completely, understandably overwrought. They had been pushed light years beyond the absolute limits of human psychological endurance. He aggressively argued that nervous, heavy trigger fingers in the presence of pure, unadulterated evil were not a war crime. They were simply the tragic, completely inevitable, and highly justified reality of total war. "You walk into a place like that," Patton reportedly fired back. "You see 2,000 dead bodies on a train, and you expect my boys to follow the rule book? Hell no." Then General Patton did something that permanently cemented his legendary, highly controversial legacy as a battlefield commander who valued raw, uncompromising moral justice infinitely more than diplomatic, bureaucratic paperwork. He completely, unapologetically bypassed the international military tribunals, the desk-bound military lawyers, and the strict text of the Geneva Convention. Depending on the specific historical account and the whispers of the men who were in the room, Patton either ripped the damning investigation report to shreds and threw it directly into a burning fire in his office, or he ordered it buried so deeply in the absolute highest level, top-secret, heavily classified military archives that it would never see the light of day during his lifetime. He looked at his stunned, silent staff officers and delivered his final, absolute, uncompromising verdict. There would absolutely be no court-martials in his army. There would be no trials, no prison sentences, and no disgrace for the American infantrymen of the 45th Division. He officially, forcefully declared that the SS Guards had gotten exactly what they deserved, and he ordered the entire military investigation permanently, irreversibly quashed. He told his staff, "There will be no trial. Dismissed." General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, was fully briefed on the incident and the existence of the explosive photographs of the death train. Eisenhower was a deeply diplomatic man, but he was also a realist. He fully realized that putting American combat heroes on public trial for slaughtering the architects of the Holocaust would cause massive, catastrophic damage to military morale and incite a total public relations nightmare back in the United States. Eisenhower quietly, completely agreed with his most aggressive general, and he let Patton's brutal, unapologetic decision stand. The charges were officially, permanently dropped. Lieutenant Jack Bushyhead, the Native American officer who had stood in the freezing snow and ordered the heavy machine gunners to open fire on the surrendering SS, packed his duffel bag and went home to the quiet plains of Oklahoma. He completely buried the memories of that bloody Sunday. He never gave interviews. He never spoke of the Dachau massacre to his family, and he died in 1977 as a silent, decorated hero carrying an incredibly dark, incredibly heavy historical secret. Today, over 75 years later, the Dachau liberation reprisals remain one of the most fiercely debated, highly controversial, and morally complex moments of the entire Second World War. It forces every single one of us to look directly into the absolute darkest, most terrifying corners of human psychology and ask deeply uncomfortable questions about the true, fundamental nature of justice. Neon-Nazi apologists and historical revisionists desperately try to use the events of April 29th to claim a false moral equivalence, arguing that the Americans were war criminals too. But serious historians and combat veterans see it entirely differently. It was absolutely not a planned, systemic genocide like the Holocaust. It was a massive, uncontrollable, violently human reaction. It was the loud, devastating snap of the human mind when it is violently, unexpectedly confronted with pure, unadulterated, industrialized evil. When you are forced to look at a starved child frozen to the floor of a cattle car, when you see a concrete room filled floor to ceiling with emaciated bodies, can you realistically remain a polite, professional, rule-abiding soldier, or do you instantly, inevitably become a merciless avenger? The exhausted, traumatized soldiers of the 45th Infantry Division made their brutal, bloody choice against that cold brick wall in the Munich snow. And General George S. Patton made the ultimate, historic, career-risking choice to protect them from the legal consequences of their rage. History has ultimately, definitively judged the 50 SS guards who bled out in the coalyard that morning. They were the arrogant architects of absolute hell on earth, and on April 29, 1945, they finally came face to face with the devil. As for the American GIs, they carried the horrific, mind-shattering memory of the death train with them every single day for the rest of their lives. Many suffered from terrible nightmares. Many drank to forget. They tried desperately to forget the sound of the machine guns and the sight of the dying guards. But they never ever regretted pulling the trigger. As one aging veteran of the liberation plainly stated years later, staring blankly into a documentary camera, "I know killing surrendering prisoners is legally wrong. But that day, at that specific place, it felt like the absolute only right thing to do. This is the hardest, most brutal, and most terrifying moral question in the entire history of modern warfare." I want you to dive directly into the comments section right now and be completely, brutally honest with yourself and with the historical record. If you had just walked past a freezing train filled with 2,000 starved, beaten, and discarded human bodies, and the well-fed men responsible for that atrocity were standing right in front of you, arrogantly demanding their legal rights and international protection, would you have pulled the trigger? Type the word "pull" in the comments below if you would have emptied your magazine into the wall, or type the word "hold" if you firmly believe that the civilized rules of war must always, strictly apply, even when dealing with absolute monsters. Hit that like button right now, not for the algorithm, but to honor the heavy, unimaginable burden carried by the men who had to walk into the depths of hell to liberate Europe. Subscribe to the channel, turn on your notifications, and keep exploring the dark, unfiltered, and deeply human truths of history with us.